Hector Voss had one principle he had never compromised in 43 years. Finish what you start, protect what you've built, and never let a man see you flinch. He built Voss Fabrication from a second-hand welding torch and a rented bay in a Tulsa industrial park into a mid-sized manufacturing company that employed 61 people and held 3 regional government contracts. He raised a daughter he would have walked through fire for, and he trusted the man she married with a blind, uncritical faith he had never extended to anyone else in his adult life. That was the one thing he had done wrong. On a Wednesday evening in March, his son-in-law handed him a notarized document across the dining room table. Not passed, not slid, placed with a particular deliberateness, the way someone sets down a glass they know will shatter. His son-in-law's name was Derek Pruitt. He had been married to Hector's daughter Avery for 6 years. He had been running the administrative side of Voss Fabrication for 4. The document he placed on the table was a buyout notice, signed, filed, and time-stamped 48 hours ago, without a single conversation. Derek had been accumulating shares quietly for 2 years. Proxy agreements, secondary transfers, a minority stake from a retiring early investor that Hector had trusted Derek to manage as a courtesy. What Hector did not know was that Derek had also been speaking with a private equity group out of Dallas for the better part of 14 months. The buyout notice gave Derek a controlling position and a mandatory redemption clause that, if exercised, would push Hector into a forced sale of his remaining shares at a valuation Hector's own financial advisor would later describe as aggressively undervalued. Derek sat across the table in a linen shirt with his hands folded, wearing the patient expression of a man who had rehearsed this conversation multiple times and felt confident about how it would go. He said that Avery agreed with the decision. From the hallway, just past the kitchen doorway, a 15-year-old girl stopped moving. Hector's granddaughter, Maya, had come downstairs for a glass of water. She stood in the dark of the hallway in her socked feet, holding her phone against her chest, and listened to her father explain to her grandfather, in measured language and a reasonable tone, why he was being removed from the company he had built with his hands. Hector looked at the document. He looked at Derek. He set his coffee mug down with a controlled steadiness that told you everything you needed to know about the kind of man he was. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He asked Derek one question. Does Avery know every detail of what this document actually does? Derek said she understood the broad strokes. Hector nodded once, looked out the window at the Tulsa skyline going dark in the distance, and said he appreciated Derek coming in person. Derek had expected tears or rage, or at minimum a raised voice. What he got was something far more disorienting. He got stillness, the absolute, practiced stillness of a man who had survived worse things than this, and had learned, over a lifetime, that the most dangerous response to a threat is the one the other person cannot read. Derek left the house 40 minutes later, assuming the conversation had gone well. He had no idea what had been set in motion in the silence between Hector's words. If you have ever built something from nothing, poured your life into it, and watched someone use your own trust to try to take it apart, stay with this story. Because what happens next is about more than a business. It is about what a man chooses to protect when everything visible has already been taken from him. Tulsa, in March, carries a cold that does not announce itself. It seeps in slow, through old window seals and under garage doors, the kind of cold that is less about temperature than about duration. Hector Voss had worked in that cold for 20 years before he could afford heat in his fabrication bay. He knew it like a second language. He was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders in a way that came from decades of actual work rather than a gym, silver at his temples, reading glasses he never wore in front of clients, a particular kind of exhaustion behind his eyes that had less to do with sleep than with the accumulated weight of watching people he loved make choices he could not stop. He had been managing a degenerative disc condition in his lower back For 3 years, the kind that made long days at a standing desk non-negotiable and certain mornings, a process of negotiation with his own body before he could move freely. His physician had been recommending reduced hours. His physician did not know Derek Pruitt. The night Derek left, Hector sat at the table with the document in front of him for a long time. He did not read it again. He had read it twice, slowly, and retained every line. What he was doing instead was something closer to what his father had called sitting with the terrain before you decide how to move through it. His daughter called at 9:17. He let it ring. Not because he did not want to speak to her, because he had learned, in the particular hard school of loving someone who is not yet ready to see clearly, that there are conversations that cannot happen before a person has fully experienced the consequences of what they have chosen. A premature conversation would only give Avery a chance to harden herself around an incomplete picture. He got up, put his coffee cup in the sink, and drove to the office. He did not go to his desk. He went to the records room, the physical records room that Derek had suggested twice in the last year they should digitize and consolidate, a suggestion Hector had resisted with no explanation beyond a vague reference to preferring the original format. That resistance had not been vague at all. He pulled 3 binders from the shelf marked Operational History, and he made 2 phone calls. The first was to a woman named Constance Merritt, who had been his business attorney for 16 years and had drafted every significant agreement Voss Fabrication had ever signed. She answered on the 3rd ring. The second was to a man named Roy Pacheco, who had been the company's independent auditor for 11 years and who had a particular gift for finding things inside a set of books that the person who prepared those books had been confident could not be found. He told them both the same thing. He needed them in his office by 7 in the morning. Neither of them asked why. They had each known Hector Voss long enough to understand that when he asked for something quietly, it was because the situation required more than noise. Hector went home at 2 in the morning, slept 4 hours, and was back in the records room by 6:15. By 8:30, Constance Merritt had her reading glasses on and a highlighter in her hand, and she had the particular focused expression of an attorney who has just found exactly what she came looking for. She looked up at Hector over her glasses. "The proxy agreement for the alderman shares," she said. "The one Derek filed as a routine administrative transfer. I see it." "Hector." She set the highlighter down. This was executed during a period when Derek held fiduciary responsibility over these shares under the company's internal governance agreement, which means this transfer carries a conflict of interest disclosure requirement that was never filed. Hector nodded slowly. The entire chain of share transfers that gave Derek his controlling position runs through this proxy agreement, Constance continued. If the original transfer is voidable, the control position built on top of it is voidable. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has seen a great many legal battles and has just identified the one point in this one where the entire structure is resting on something fragile. "I need you to tell me," she said, "how long you have known about this." Hector looked at her steadily. "Long enough." She stared at him for a count of several seconds. Then she uncapped her pen. "Walk me through what you want to do." In the psychology of betrayal, there is a well-documented phenomenon researchers call the planning paradox. The person who has been wronged, if they are analytical by nature, experiences the injury not as an emotional collapse, but as a kind of clarifying force. The noise falls away. The essentials come into focus. The mind, denied the luxury of denial, moves directly to the architecture of response. Hector Voss had been living inside the planning paradox for 4 months before Derek Pruitt ever placed that document on the dining room table, because 4 months earlier, an accounts payable discrepancy that his operations manager had flagged as a rounding error had led Hector, on a Thursday night, with a cup of cold coffee and a 12-year-old spreadsheet, to something that was not a rounding error at all. It was the edge of a pattern. And Hector, who had spent 30 years learning how to read patterns in metal stress and material tolerance, understood immediately what he was looking at. He had said nothing to Derek. He had said nothing to Avery. He had called Roy Pacheco the next morning and asked him to begin a confidential internal audit under the guise of preparation for a routine compliance review. He had also called Constance Merritt to update a series of documents that had been sitting in her files for 12 years, including a silent trust structure he had originally established at the company's founding, naming a beneficiary that was not Voss Fabrication's operating entity, but something older and legally prior to it. Derek Pruitt had spent 14 months building a position on what he believed was the company's financial architecture. He had been working on a foundation that belonged to someone else. He simply had not known to look for it. The thing about certain kinds of quiet men is that people confuse the silence for absence. They assume that because nothing is being said, nothing is being done. Derek Pruitt had made that assumption about his father-in-law for 6 years. It was the most expensive mistake of his life. 3 weeks after the buyout notice was filed, Derek's attorney received a formal response from Constance Merritt's office. It ran to 31 pages. The covering letter was 4 sentences. Derek read it in his car in a parking structure in downtown Tulsa, and then sat very still for 11 minutes, which was how long it took him to absorb what had happened. The night the response was filed, Hector was at the shop, not in the executive offices but on the floor, in the fabrication bay, in a pair of old work boots and a safety vest, talking with a line supervisor named Pete Garland, who had been with the company since second year. They were looking at a stress fracture pattern in a batch of structural components that had come in from a vendor Pete had concerns about. It was past 8 in the evening. The bay was mostly empty. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The cold pressed in around the edges of the building. Hector crouched next to the component rack, which cost him something in his lower back that he managed with a slow exhale and a practiced mental detachment from the sensation. He examined the fracture pattern with a flashlight and asked Pete 3 questions. Then he told Pete he was right to flag it and to pull the whole batch. Pete said, quiet and without looking up from the components, "You holding up, boss?" Hector stood slowly, clicked off the flashlight. "Yeah, this stuff with Derek." Pete shook his head once. "People talk. I know, you built this place. I know that too." Pete looked at him directly, in the way that men who have worked side by side for years sometimes do, without performance and without distance. "You're going to be all right." Hector looked at the fracture pattern in the metal, at the place where the stress had accumulated invisibly over time, in a spot no one had thought to check, until the structure could not hold any further. "Yeah," he said again, "I am." Meanwhile, Derek had moved quickly after the buyout notice, the way people do when they have confused the absence of immediate resistance with the absence of any resistance at all. He had brought the Dallas Equity Group in for a preliminary walkthrough of the facility. He had begun quietly repositioning certain operational relationships in ways that would make the transition to new ownership cleaner. He had mentioned to 2 of Hector's longest-standing clients that the company was entering an exciting new phase of growth and that they should expect some changes in their account management structure. He had also, in a meeting at a Tulsa hotel conference room that he believed was entirely private, told the Equity Group's lead partner that the founding generation was stepping aside and that the new management structure would be more oriented toward scaling and less toward what he called the old-school relationship model. There were 3 people in that conference room. One of them knew Roy Pacheco personally. Roy Pacheco, for his part, had by this point completed his audit. The findings were contained in a document that ran to 47 pages and which, when Constance Merritt reviewed it alongside the proxy agreement disclosure failure, gave her enough material to file not just a challenge to the share transfer structure, but a formal complaint with the State Securities Division regarding disclosure obligations. Derek found out about the complaint on a Friday afternoon when his attorney called him and used a tone of voice that Derek had never heard from her before. She asked him whether he had been completely candid with her about the timeline of the Alderman proxy transfer. He said yes. She asked him again, more slowly. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to become its own answer. His attorney said she would need to review her files before they spoke further. Derek went home and found Avery in the kitchen. He began to explain what was happening. He used phrases like legal technicality and procedural challenge, and the attorneys are managing it. Avery listened with the same expression she had been wearing for weeks now, a look Derek had been telling himself was support, but which was, more accurately, the expression of someone trying very hard to believe something they have already begun to doubt. She asked him one question. Did you tell my father everything you were doing before you filed that notice? Derek said there had been some misalignment in communication. Avery turned and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where Maya was sitting on the porch with headphones on and her knees pulled up to her chest. And she did not say anything else. The thing psychology tells us about the moment a person begins to see clearly is that it rarely announces itself with a revelation. It arrives quietly, through an accumulation of small details that suddenly organize themselves into a pattern the person can no longer explain away. Avery Voss had spent 6 years being very good at explaining things away. She had attributed her father's occasional gravity around Derek to generational tension. She had attributed Derek's increasing confidence in operational decisions he had not previously been involved in to professional growth. She had attributed her own unease, the specific low-grade discomfort that had been her companion since the previous autumn, to stress. Standing at the kitchen window watching her daughter sit alone on those porch steps, Avery stopped explaining things away. She called her father the next morning. He answered on the second ring. She said, I need to know everything, from the beginning. He said, come to the office. I'll have Roy pull the files. She arrived at 9. She sat across from her father in the conference room, where he had first reviewed the buyout notice, and Constance Merritt walked her through the audit findings, the proxy transfer issue, the securities complaint, and the timeline that Roy Pacheco had reconstructed showing when Derek had begun his arrangement with the Dallas Equity Group. Avery did not speak for a long time. Then she looked at her father and said, How long did you know? Hector looked at his daughter across the table. The same table he had bought second-hand when the company moved into this building 18 years ago, the one she used to do her homework at after school, because he did not always have someone to watch her. The one that had been in every version of this office through 3 different suites and 2 renovations. Long enough to do this correctly, he said, rather than fast. Avery pressed her hands flat on the table and looked at them. I kept asking him to bring you in on decisions, she said. I told him it mattered to you. I know. He said you'd be resistant to the direction he wanted to take the company. Hector nodded. He had heard a version of this from other people over the past 4 months. The narrative Derek had been building, quietly and carefully, in every professional relationship he had access to, was that Hector was a good founder but not a growth-oriented operator, that the company had outgrown his leadership model, that the transition was, in fact, being done out of care for the business, and ultimately for Hector himself. It was a well-constructed story. Derek understood narrative. He had always been better at the story of the company than at the company itself. Dad, Avery said. Her voice had changed. Maya was in the hallway that night. She heard everything. Hector was quiet for a moment. He had known this. He had seen the light under Maya's bedroom door when he passed it on his way upstairs, had heard the particular silence of a teenager who is lying very still and very awake. I know, he said. She hasn't spoken to Derek since. A silence moved through the room that had a texture to it. the specific density of a space in which something important and irreversible is being acknowledged. Hector looked at his daughter. He thought about the night she was born, about the years he had driven her to school from this same office building, when she was too young to understand why her father was already at work before the sun came up, about the way she had looked at Derek Pruitt on their wedding day, with a trust so complete and so unguarded that it had made Hector's chest ache with the simple complexity of loving someone and knowing you cannot protect them from every outcome. "She's going to be all right," he said. "You're both going to be all right." The legal proceedings moved with the methodical, impersonal momentum of a process that has been properly constructed. A challenge to a share transfer, when it is properly founded, does not require drama. It requires documentation. And documentation, in this case, was something that Hector Voss had spent 43 years learning to maintain with a precision that, in retrospect, had looked to everyone around him like simple organizational habit rather than what it actually was. A man who understood, at a foundational level, that what you can prove is the only thing that can never be taken from you. The proxy transfer challenge was upheld at the initial review. The share transfers built on top of it were rendered structurally voidable pending further proceedings. The state securities filing created a separate track of inquiry that, on its own, was enough to terminate the Dallas Equity Group's interest in the acquisition. Their lead partner called Derek's attorney with a brief, professionally courteous notification that they were withdrawing from the transaction. Derek received that notification on a Thursday morning and sat in his home office staring at his desk for a long time. He called Avery 3 times that afternoon. She did not answer. He drove to the house they shared and found her in the driveway with 2 bags already in the back of her car. Maya was sitting in the passenger seat. The conversation in the driveway lasted 9 minutes. This was not because there was nothing to say. It was because there was, by that point, very little left to say that had not already been said in the accumulated language of everything that had happened. Derek said he needed her to understand the full context. Avery said she understood the full context. He said he had done what he believed was best for the company's future. She said she knew what he believed. He said he had not intended for her father to be hurt. She looked at him for a moment with the clear, exhausted eyes of someone who has finally stopped filling in gaps with the most charitable possible interpretation. "You handed him a document at the dinner table, Derek." The dinner table where he had Sunday meals with Maya for 15 years, without a conversation. She opened the car door. "I'll have my attorney contact yours." She backed out of the driveway. Maya did not look out the window. There is a particular quality to a house when it becomes a building again, when the accumulated weight of people living inside it goes quiet all at once. Derek stood in the driveway for a while after the car turned out of the sight, and he did not know quite what to do with the silence. The thing about constructing a narrative in which you are the forward-thinking one, the visionary, the person unafraid to make difficult decisions for the greater good, is that it requires the ongoing presence of people who believe it. Derek Pruitt discovered, in the weeks that followed, that the audience for that narrative had grown very small very quickly. The company clients he had pre-briefed about the transition became difficult to reach. The professional connections he had cultivated through his access to Voss Fabrications network began responding to his outreach with a particular polite vagueness that communicates, in the language of professional relationships, that a person has been assessed and found to be in a different category than they believed. The equity group had not simply withdrawn. They had, through the ordinary channels of their network, communicated what had happened in a way that moved faster and further than Derek had anticipated. He filed a counter-challenge to the share transfer ruling. His attorney advised against it with an unambiguous recommendation. He filed it anyway, because he was a person who, when the story he had constructed about himself was threatened, responded by committing more fully to it rather than examining it. The counter-challenge was dismissed quickly, with a brevity that suggested the reviewing body had not required extensive deliberation. By late April, Derek Pruitt was no longer affiliated with Voss Fabrication in any legal or operational capacity. His stake, restored to the pre-transfer structure, represented a minority position with no governance rights. He retained an attorney to explore his options and was told, with increasing directness over a series of conversations, that his options were limited. He ran into Hector once, in the lobby of a building downtown where they had both arrived for separate meetings. It was a Tuesday morning in May. The light through the lobby windows was the particular clear light of a Tulsa spring, warm and unhurried and indifferent to the people moving through it. Derek stopped. Hector continued toward the elevator. Derek said his name. Hector turned around. There was a pause. The specific, dense pause that forms between two people who have said everything that needs to be said through the formal mechanisms that exist for exactly that purpose, and who are now standing in a lobby with nothing left that those mechanisms cannot communicate more precisely than words can. Derek said, "I genuinely believed it was the right move for the company." Hector looked at him for a moment. The look was not cold. It was not satisfied. It held the specific quality of a man who has spent a great deal of time understanding something and no longer needs to perform that understanding for anyone else's benefit. "I believe that you believed that," Hector said. He turned and pressed the elevator button. Derek said, "Is there any version of this where we know?" Hector's voice was even and final, not unkind. "There isn't." The elevator opened. He stepped in. The doors closed behind him. Maya was waiting for him when he got back to the office that afternoon. She had started coming in after school twice a week, since Avery had taken a temporary role, managing the client relationship side while the company stabilized. Hector had given Maya a small desk in the corner of the conference room where she did her homework, the same conference room, the same kind of late afternoon arrangement that Avery herself had once had in an earlier version of this office. Maya did not particularly love business. She loved architecture, specifically the kind that involved sustainable material systems, and she had a sketchbook full of structural drawings that she had been quietly developing since she was 12. But she came to the office twice a week because there was something in the particular atmosphere of a place where people are building something that she found clarifying. And because her grandfather was there. She looked up from her sketchbook when he came in. "You okay?" Hector set his keys on the table. "Yeah, I heard you ran into him." He sat down across from her. The afternoon light came through the conference room windows, the way it always did at this hour, long and golden, making the dust in the air visible in slow-moving columns. The kind of light that makes ordinary rooms look briefly significant. "Can I ask you something?" Maya said. "Sure. Why didn't you just fight him right away when you first found out what he was doing?" Hector picked up one of her pencils from the table and turned it in his hands. "Because fighting right away would have been about what I was feeling," he said, "and I needed it to be about what was true." She looked at him with the specific evaluation of a 15-year-old who is trying to determine whether this is wisdom or a rationalization. "Were you scared?" "Yes." "Of losing the company?" Hector considered this. "Of losing the thing I built it for," he said, "which is not the same thing." Maya was quiet for a moment. She looked back at her sketchbook. Then she looked back up. "Grandpa, yeah, I want to design buildings that last 100 years. Not because they're made of expensive materials, because the structure is right." Hector looked at her for a moment. He thought about a trust document signed 12 years ago, about the difference between what is visible and what is foundational, about how the most important structures in any life are the ones no one thinks to look at because they have never given anyone a reason to. "That's exactly right," he said. They sat together in the afternoon light. Outside, the sound of the fabrication floor was distant and steady. the sound of something being built. The rest resolved with the quiet, irreversible momentum of things that have been correctly structured from the beginning. Constance Merritt filed the final restoration documents in late May. Hector's operating position in Voss Fabrication was fully reinstated with an amended governance agreement that Constance described as significantly more protected than what had existed before. Roy Pacheco's audit, submitted as supporting documentation, identified 2 additional areas of financial irregularity in the period of Derek's administrative oversight that were referred for further review. The Dallas Equity Group moved on to other acquisitions. Derek Pruitt began consulting independently at a scale considerably smaller than what he had anticipated 18 months prior. Avery filed for divorce in June. She did not discuss this with Hector before she did it, which told him more about where she had arrived than anything she could have said. She simply called him the evening after and said she had made a decision. He said he supported it. She said she knew. There was a pause, the comfortable kind, the kind that belongs to 2 people who have been through something real together and are on the other side of it. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Getting there," she said. "That's the right pace." She laughed a little, which was the first time he had heard that in several months. The sound of it reached him somewhere uncomplicated and essential. The company's third-quarter numbers came in strong. Pete Garland was promoted to operations director. 2 of the client relationships Derek had quietly complicated were restored through direct conversations that Hector had himself on the phone in the old-school relationship model he had never once considered abandoning. On a Friday evening in late August, Hector and Maya drove out to the fabrication bay after hours. She had been asking for weeks to look at the structural system of the original building, the load-bearing arrangement from when the facility was expanded 12 years ago. She wanted to sketch the connection points. She had a theory about how the support distribution had been designed, and she wanted to see whether the actual structure confirmed it. It did. She sat on an equipment case with her sketchbook open and sketched the connection points for 35 minutes without speaking. Hector stood nearby looking at the fabrication floor, the clean concrete, the organized equipment lines, the physical evidence of every year of work that had gone into this place. His back ached in its familiar, manageable way. He breathed through it and let it settle. "Hey," Maya said, without looking up from her sketch. "Yeah, this support beam." She pointed with her pencil at the main lateral connection running along the interior wall. "It's carrying more load than the design probably specified." Hector looked at it. The floor above was added after the original build. Roy flagged it years ago. "We reinforced the connection point but left the original beam, because the original beam was already stronger than it needed to be." "That's right." Maya looked at the beam for a moment. Then she went back to her sketch. "You did that on purpose," she said. "When you built it." Hector said nothing. Outside, the August evening was warm and settling into that particular amber hour before full dark. A freight truck moved along the service road that ran beside the building, its lights washing briefly across the high windows of the fabrication bay. "You build things to hold more than they'll ever need to hold," Maya said, "because you don't know what you'll eventually need to put on top of them." She was still looking at her sketch, but the pencil had stopped moving. Hector looked at his granddaughter, at the sketchbook in her hands, the building in her mind, the 15 years of mornings and dinners and drives to school and homework at conference room tables that had made her exactly who she was. He thought about a lot of things in that moment, about the trust document with her mother's name at the top that was now restructured with additional protections that Constance had quietly suggested, about the company that had been taken from the surface down while the foundation held, about the quality of light on the fabrication floor, which was not beautiful in the way that Miami beach light is beautiful, but was beautiful in its own industrial, honest way, the way that things built for use and endurance are always a little beautiful when you know what went into them. Yeah, he said. That's the idea. Maya nodded once, satisfied, and went back to her sketch. Some things teach you everything by trying to take everything. The attempt is the lesson. Derek Pruitt had believed he was acquiring a company. He had not understood that the most valuable component of Voss fabrication had never appeared in any of the documents he filed, any of the spreadsheets he reviewed, any of the presentations he prepared for the Dallas Equity Group. It was not a line item. It was not an asset class. It was the quality of the man who built it, and the quality of the people who had grown up watching him build it. You can transfer a share. You cannot transfer that. 3 things worth holding on to from what Hector Voss chose to do. The first, document the foundation before you need it. Hector did not call Constance Merritt the night Derek placed that notice on the table. He had called her 12 years earlier, on a Thursday afternoon with no immediate crisis, to establish a structure whose only purpose was to protect what mattered. If you have built something, if you have a business interest, a property arrangement, a financial structure that others have access to, ask your attorney one question this week. Is the underlying foundation documented in a way that protects it independently of any surface-level transfer? One conversation, one document. That is what made the difference. The second, the person who tries to rewrite your story while you are standing in it is telling you exactly how they see you. Derek's narrative required Hector to be the past, the obstacle, the founder who couldn't let go. Hector never argued with that narrative. He simply continued to be, with complete precision and without performance, the thing that narrative required him not to be. You do not defeat a false story by arguing with it. You defeat it by remaining entirely yourself. The third, the most enduring thing you can give the people who come after you, is the memory of watching you hold steady when holding steady was hard. Maya Pruitt, who will one day design buildings that last 100 years, sat in a fabrication bay on a Friday evening and learned something about structure that no architecture program will be able to teach her. She learned it by watching her grandfather stand still in a cold industrial bay at the end of a very long year and talk about load-bearing capacity like a man who understands at the level of the body what it means to carry more than your share and not give way. That is what stays. Not the outcome, not the documents, the memory of the load-bearing and the fact that it held. Hector Voss drove home through the Tulsa night with his granddaughter asleep in the passenger seat, her sketchbook open on her lap, a pencil still loosely held in her hand. The city moved around them, lit and unhurried, going about the ordinary business of a Friday evening in late summer, entirely unaware that something had been restored that season. Not spectacularly. Not with any fanfare. Just correctly, piece by piece, in the way that things built to last are always restored when they need to be. He pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment after the engine went quiet. The most important things he had ever built were not on any balance sheet. He had always known that. Now, he thought, Maya was beginning to know it too.